System of a Down, Toxicity.
Wake up! Wake up! Run, rush, and put a little makeup!
I started off each other list with the most influential band of that decade. However, in the 21st century, metal had gone in so many directions, it would be ridiculous to say that one single band was entirely influential. That said, System of a Down is one of the most significant bands of the early 2000s. They did release an album in 1998, but Toxicity is an improvement in every single way. This sophomore is the most emblematic alternative metal record. I mentioned in the previous installments that I am using the stages of grief to represent each decade. The early 2000s are bargaining. One of the most iconic songs of this decade, Chop Suey, perfectly captures bargaining. One common trait of this stage of grief is pleading to a higher power. This is done during the bridge. Another thing that you'll notice about early 2000s metal is how often the vocals are used to dialogue with one another. In this song, there are two perspectives. The verses are that of an abuser, taunting and gaslighting in rapid succession. You wanted to! Put a little makeup! You wanted to! I discussed the fader with the shake up! You wanted to! Whereas the chorus is of the victim's perspective. Self-righteous suicide! Despite this somewhat serious interpretation, this song is often thought of as funny, perhaps just because the song is titled Chop Suey and features Serj Tankian eating the food of the same name in the music video, even though it has very little relevance to the actual lyrics. System of a Down managed to be funny and serious at the same time. Despite the serious nature of many tracks here, they have a good sense of humor. Here are some funny moments.
I brought my pogo stick just to show her a trick. She had so many friends.
Contrast is a big theme in early 2000s music. However, my favorite tracks are their more straightforward ones. For me, Atwa has always been their best. The vocal harmonies are fantastic, capable of being soothing.
All the world I've seen before me passing by,
but also intense. It's powerful and captures a sense of alienation like nothing else. Science is another great one that is quite underrated. It's about how science has reduced the human experience by eliminating spirituality. Science has failed our mother. It even has a part that really switches things up and has a more primal mood to it, hammering in the theme. Toxicity is a record that, while strange, has aged rather well. I can give it glowing praise by saying that it very well may be the album that I have listened to the most in my life. That's not to say it is the best album of all time or anything, but its catchy tunes, excellent harmonies, and idiosyncratic character do make this legendary. It's not a perfect album. It does have a couple of flaws. Multiply is a skippable track, and the spouting of statistics and advocacy of policy change in Prison Song is really clunky, despite the fact that I love the chorus of that song. Minor issues aside, this is definitely one of the best albums of the early 2000s, and some of its messages ring ever truer today.
They're trying to build a prison for you and me.
Meshuggah, Nothing. Meshuggah is like nothing else, and their influence is strongly felt in many bands from the 2010s onwards. However, back in 2002, they were the only ones doing the palm mutes and polyrhythms we now call djent. Today, the genre is such a meme that Periphery just released something called Djent is not a genre. I do not agree. Djent is a genre. Change my mind. But I think that the style has become diluted since its inception. Meshuggah may very well be the only truly 100% djent band. It very much feels like an evolution of the groove metal that dominated in the 90s. And if you thought groove metal was offbeat with its syncopation, then this is something else. Its mathy patterns can be hard to follow. Metal has come a long way from its origin, but just because it's odd and jazzy, that doesn't mean that the riffs are not great mosh material, like Rational Gaze. My favorite track is Closed Eye Visuals. I also love the mind-warping lyrics. They are just as disorienting as the music itself. Nothing is fantastic. There is a reason many emulate this beast of a band, but few can truly replicate the sheer grandness of this. DragonForce, Inhuman Rampage. Everyone knows, Through the Fire and Flames. Every time I hear it, it brings me back to 2007. It always makes me think of Guitar Hero and early YouTube. It is one of the most iconic metal tunes of that era. It is fitting that I am being nostalgic, as that is one thing that this album represents. There was a resurgence of 80s style metal in the early 2000s. While power metal still existed in the 90s, there wasn't as much of it, and it made a comeback largely thanks to this release. But this isn't a strictly power metal record. It's also trance metal. It's got that electronic and pop influence, so it sounds a bit more fresh, rather than just being entirely an 80s rehash. There's even a part with some auto-tune. So you can definitely tell that it's not from the 80s, but it is definitely paying homage to it. I imagine that this was a great gateway into metal for many people, but even as an avid metalhead, I can still enjoy some DragonForce. And as far as this series goes, it's probably refreshing to hear some happy and upbeat music after all of the angry bands from the 90s. The closing ballad is also a cheese fest that sounds very influenced from the 80s. Through the fire and the flames, we carry on. Hatebreed, Supremacy.
Destroy everything!
This is my #1 recommendation if you need some self-improvement or workout music. One listen to Destroy Everything should get your blood pumping.
Destroy everything! Obliterate what makes us one!
Now here we get into some semantics. This type of music was originally called metalcore back in the 90s. However, metalcore today is quite a different thing than it was back then, at least in its colloquial sense. So nowadays, some have started calling Hatebreed sound metallic hardcore instead. It's actually pretty insane that metalcore has technically existed in 4 different decades at this point, and in each decade, it seems to mean a different sound when the term is used. But I will get into that later. This is too much semantics for music like this. Supremacy is Big Chad energy throughout. From Defeatist,
You and I will never be the same!
to the Threshold. Just mosh and be kings already.
I will build them up, I will lead them to the threshold!
All that remains, the fall of ideals. In my opinion, this is the iconic melodic metalcore band. Now, unfortunately, I have to get into semantics once more, since some people misunderstood this term last time I used it. When I was first introduced to All That Remains back in the day, they were metalcore to me. It seems that in the early 2000s, this type of sound was what people thought of when you used the term metalcore, and in many ways, this is still what I think of. Today, in this year of our Lord, 2023, people tend to think of something like Bring Me the Horizon or Bad Omens as metalcore, and since metalheads have a tendency to think of melodic as simply meaning the softer or sissier version of something, when they hear me use the term melodic metalcore, they predictably go,
Ha! Gay!
But keep in mind that metalcore meant the Hatebreed variety, and melodic is in reference to the melodic death metal influence from bands like In Flames. So I'm not saying it's a softer, wimpier version of something like Bad Omens. I'm saying that this sound is somewhere between Hatebreed and In Flames.
I am a macho man, but I'm not falling, I'm not broken yet!
That is the sound I'm referring to when I say melodic metalcore, so please keep that in mind going forward. I could start calling it melodic metallic hardcore, but that is a bit of a mouthful. The genre also has the classic contrasting vocals, the scream verse, sing chorus, that melodic metalcore popularized in the 2000s. There is some similarity between this and the Beauty and the Beast vocal style gothic metal employed in the 90s. However, that was two separate vocalists, often a man and a woman. Here, this 2000s version, which I will call Jekyll and Hyde vocals, featured a single vocalist who would employ both screaming and singing. Today, this is so normal in metal that we take it for granted, but before 2000, there weren't many bands that did both the harsh and clean vocals in such sharp contrast. Fall of Ideals honestly has it all. Fantastic melodies, catchy choruses, verses that just pack a punch, some good lyrics, and of course, we got some breakdowns. It might just be the single most greatest metalcore album. Just give it a listen. Arch Enemy, Doomsday Machine.
You talk, you take, never giving anything back.
Arch Enemy is one of the most well-known melodic death metal bands, and this record sure has a ton of gorgeous melodies. Most people only know the track Nemesis, which is a fine tune in itself. But there are actually quite a few memorable tracks on this. My personal favorite being the anthemic Taking Back My Soul. Now, one reoccurring motif in the early 2000s is that of the Faustian bargain, or the deal with the devil. This song is a clever inversion of it, and is quite powerful. But get used to hearing the word soul if you listen to a lot of early 2000s metal, as bargaining is a huge and consistent theme of this decade. I love melodic metal styles. Both melodic death metal and melodic metalcore were exploding in the early 2000s. And much like Fall of Ideals, Doomsday Machine is pretty much perfect. Just great compositions and quality production. I listened to these in preparation for this video, and I was actually impressed how well they held up. Not that it had been very long since I've listened to them last, but nevertheless, every track on these two are excellent. I would not be surprised if someone sold their soul to make such godly music. Maybe it's rose-tinted glasses, maybe it's just because this type of metal is few and far between these days, but damn, is this ever my jam. Nightwish, Dark Passion Play. Symphonic metal, while it briefly started in the 90s, didn't really blossom until the 21st century came around. In contrast to gothic metal, symphonic metal is much more bombastic, taking a more upbeat and epic approach, with the backing of a symphony orchestra. This is a fairly eclectic record. It starts off with a near 13-minute borderline prog metal opener, but then it follows up with some more catchy, shorter, radio-friendly tunes, like Bye Bye Beautiful and Amaranth, which are more in the vein of alternative metal. Then, later on, the tracks The Islander and Last of the Wilds are extremely folk metal. So this has a fair bit of variety throughout. I'm sure many metalheads may write this album off as girlfriend's first metal album, but I can't deny it is a solid record. And as with much of early 2000s metal, there's great contrast between vocal styles on top of the fantastic musicianship. Watain, Sworn to the Dark. This very well may be my favorite black metal record. While technically, it's melodic black metal, but for some reason, that term gets thrown around significantly less than melodic death metal does. My guess as to why is twofold. First, black metal fans are a bit hipsterish and underground, so they have an allergy to the word melodic. Second, it's black metal, so even when it is melodic, it's still not that melodic. Hell, even Dissection was more melodic than this is, because they were just as much of a death metal band as they were a black metal band. But with Watain, the melody is much more subtle. That said, the tracks on display here are still catchy, and I would rank this just as highly as the other melodic metal picks I have discussed so far. Satan's Hunger is magnificent. I'm not sure anything else captures the Faustian spirit like this does. I have a distinct memory, as corny as it is looking back, of walking through town at night, blasting this on my phone's crappy speaker, and howling along throughout the night. The track has such vigor to it. Man, this record is great. The title track is iconic.
Sword to the dark.
If you don't know it, do you even know black metal?
Who put you on the planet? Ugh.
But perhaps the best song is Stellarvor. It's so triumphant and pounding, with so much space to let everything breathe.
God of death.
It feels as if you are summoning a dark spirit to devour the very stars. I know that black metal isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I like to sip on this every now and then. Electric Wizard, Dope Throne. This is a beast of a record, combining stoner doom metal with sludge metal. This album sounds like Black Sabbath on steroids. It is so heavy that it might as well be on Jupiter. I was a bit too groove metal and death metal centric on my 90s list, so I hope to make up for it with a bit more variety this time. But I'm not just going to include a doom metal pick, I'm going to include the doom metal pick. Funeralopolis is one of the best metal songs ever made. It begins with this chill, bluesy, bassy section, which goes on for a while. And then the riff erupts, and it is glorious. The sheer weight of it, and it hypnotizes you with its repetition. When the vocals kick in, you can hear the pure angst in the voice. It describes a planet of pure death, a zombified biosphere, a funeralopolis. It ends with a repeated plea to end the Earth through nuclear destruction. It is quite an explosive ending, you could say. Phenomenal. Another great track is We Hate You, which is a particularly good listen if you are having a bad day and are feeling like your favorite insert literally me character here. Megadeth, United Abominations.
Washington is next.
Alright, so this is the third time that Megadeth has appeared in these lists. This will be the last time, but for variety's sake, I wanted to put some thrash metal on this list, and given Metallica's offerings, it's definitely gonna be Megadeth. This is the same old song and dance, genre-wise, maybe with a slight alternative metal influence, but it is a bit more spicy thematically. Megadeth have always been rebellious and anti-authority, but on this record, they actually latch onto the United Nations as a target of criticism, making this album a little bit, if only marginally so, more politically charged than their other albums.
We all know this is wrong, but the New World Order's beating down the door.
But I think that extra spice gives the lyrics an extra sting and makes the songs rather punchy. They would probably get cancelled today if they released Washington Is Next now. But that said, this isn't super partisan, and it's not necessarily any more political than, say, And Justice for All is. I do hate, however, how the title track does the same thing that Prison Song on Toxicity did.
2 million Americans are incarcerated in the prison system. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan.
I have a bit of a pet peeve about songs where the singer doesn't really sing, rather just kind of talks and lists facts and statistics in a very dry and monotone way. And I know, pot, kettle, black.
Can you forgive me? Forgive me. Forgive me.
But these two songs are good in spite of those parts, not because of them. Megadeth is talented enough that they could probably get away with farting mid-song, and it would still be listenable. But my point remains. Play for Blood is a great track. Very much seems like a bargaining tune to me.
I don't play for your soul. I don't play to win. I don't play for it all.
Finally, this album has a remake of their 90s song, A Tout le Monde. This time, being in the early 2000s, it is unsurprisingly a duet, and this duet is between Dave Mustaine and Christina Scabbia, the singer of Lacuna Coil. I actually prefer this version to the original. I like United Abominations a lot, and now that I'm cancelled, let's move on.
I know your enemy, it once was me. Oh.
Korn, take a look in the mirror.
I'm feeling me today. Not lost, not blown away.
I've learned only recently that this album is massively unpopular, even among Korn fans. I must just be a born contrarian. It's a gift, really.
It is a gift.
But this might be my favorite by them. Oh wait, hold on. I am getting a message. I've just been informed that Jonathan Davis does not do the scatting vocals on this one. There is not one single on the whole of the duration. Okay, I changed my mind then. 0 out of 10, worst album of all time, but bye. Our acculturation continues, as we ask ourselves. Besides that unfortunate fact, though, I do love this. The bass is juicy.
What's the best way to describe these? Juicy?
I think they nailed the production on this one. The vitriolic, angst-laced opener, that is, Right Now, is one of the highlights. Y'all Want a Single is another one, which is one of their funnier tracks. They seem to have been going for the world record for most F-bombs dropped in a single track.
Y'all want a single say fuck that. Fuck that, fuck that.
Y'all want a single say fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that.
And I've always got a kick out of it. Korn can be rather hit and miss, but this is one album that is consistently solid from start to finish. It is a good mix of nu metal and alternative metal. It's one of the more angsty, emotional driven type of metal albums, so it's not for everyone, but a definite recommend from me. Dream Theater, Systematic Chaos. This is a phenomenal prog metal record. I was torn between this, Train of Thought, and Octavarium, all good choices. Now Train of Thought might be the most metal one. I would have been tempted to pick it, but when I made my prog metal video, the copyright police weren't very happy that I uploaded material from that one, so hopefully I can go under the radar by picking this one instead. Octavarium is also great, maybe a bit more mainstream, a bit more alternative metal, and Systematic Chaos feels like a happy medium between these other two albums. It might be growing on me to the point that it's my new personal favorite. Constant Motion is the best tune, a faster one with a thrashy vibe. But then there's the slower, Forsaken, which is more ballad-like. Then there's the sinister, Dark Eternal Night. All tracks on this one are, as you can guess, quite long, but they don't get boring. In my opinion, this is them at their best. Solid musicianship and plenty of memorable moments. Check it out. It is both emotionally moving and full of excellent riffage. The Black Dahlia Murder, Nocturnal. One of the most distinctive sounding extreme metal acts, not only because of Trevor's very recognizable screams, but also their unique blend of death metal, melodic death metal, and deathcore. I don't think that I've ever seen another band's style be quite as fiercely debated and gatekeeped as this one. I guess this would be a good place to say that whether you think they are deathcore or not, we can agree to disagree, and just be content that we both enjoy this awesome band. There seems to be little nuance with the genre debates. I am just saying what I hear when I attempt to categorize them. Also, this would be a good point to mention that these lists are not in any particular order, which is why I have not been numbering them. What a Horrible Night to Have a Curse is the best track. I love the riffs, the melodies, the high screams and low growls, and all that layered together. Nocturnal has that campy horror vibe, but on this track it is especially apparent as they are singing about Castlevania II: Simon's Quest.
Why does this need to happen so often, like every 5 minutes? Why does it take so long? Nobody feels like sitting through this every time. I mean, the monsters are stronger at night and the stores are closed, but why is that necessary and why does the game have to stop?
So that only adds to that vibe when you know that. Wicked death metal record, whatever you categorize it as. It totally matches the dark fantasy aesthetic of the album cover. Avenged Sevenfold, Waking the Fallen. Avenged Sevenfold is perhaps the most iconic early 2000s metal band, but they got famous towards the end of the decade, where they had a much more radio-friendly, alternative metal sound, and even delved into country a little bit.
Put that thing back where it came from, or so help me!
Their 2007 record is definitely a sellout album, if there ever was one. But 2003's Waking the Fallen is anything but. This one is much more raw, and with much more screaming. Being a mix of melodic metalcore, prog metal, and hard rock, I've never heard anything else quite like this, and that includes from Avenged Sevenfold themselves. Unholy Confessions is the most well-known off of this record, and the most straightforward. It is a metalcore classic. But my favorite track, by far, is Eternal Rest. It rips open with a killer guitar solo. And then you get this groovy metal and roll riff. It's perfect. There is also a bit of gothic atmosphere towards the end. The lengthy two-parter, I Won't See You Tonight, displays their more proggy side. Nothing that Avenged Sevenfold released after this one ever captured the same energy. I do like some of their later efforts a lot, don't get me wrong, but I think they were sort of forced to change their sound after Waking the Fallen due to Matt Shadow's throat surgery, which discouraged him from screaming. Which is why his voice sounds a bit off on City of Evil, and many dislike his style of singing. But even if that ruins their other records for you, it's no issue here. I highly recommend this 2000s masterpiece. Agalloch, Ashes Against the Grain. This might be considered one of the more hipster-type metal albums, one that sound-wise might be more suited to the 2010s than the 2000s, being primarily a mix of post-metal and black metal with some folk influence. It is slightly ahead of its time. This is a more atmospheric album, rather than being about catchy choruses and killer riffs, though this record does have some moments of each. My favorite tracks are Falling Snow and Not Unlike the Waves. I'm sure that one would expect this to be the music of hemp latte drinking Cascadians, and it very well might be, but it's solid music with some pagan themes. Ashes Against the Grain is a great listen to admire nature to. The Haunted, One Kill Wonder. Now by contrast, this one is much more in line with 90s metal, combining groove metal and melodic death metal. This has a killer sound. No doubt, the obvious comparison would be Lamb of God, but given the choice between the two for this list, I gotta say that The Haunted has an edge. Sacrament may be a great album, but One Kill Wonder has a Swedish death metal vibe and a true crime aesthetic that just makes it even more brutal. But the songs are just as catchy as Lamb of God is. So I thought I would choose the band that's not on everyone's radar already, just to shake up the list a bit. A dark and gritty album that hits you like a brick to the face. Dead on Arrival is wicked.
You try to repent until the time that kills the screams. You know it's the end.
Cradle of Filth, Nymphetamine.
Pouring emerald wine into crystal glasses.
Cradle of Filth tends to be quite hated in metal spheres, probably because they are peripherally black metal, and black metal is the most gate-kept genre and community. To be fair, their sound is a bit diluted to be considered part of the genre proper, but this is a great record nevertheless. I would describe their style on Nymphetamine as a blend of melodic black metal, melodic metalcore, and gothic metal. It should be noted that this record employs both the Beauty and the Beast and the Jekyll and Hyde vocals. The title track even featuring Liv Christine from Theater of Tragedy. But the most iconic thing about Cradle of Filth is simply Danny Filth's vocal delivery, which is loved by some and hated by others. However, there is no denying that no one else sounds quite like him. Great contrast throughout. Gentle piano one moment, and then guitar riffs the next. My favorite track is Absinthe with Faust. And no, it's not just because it's literally about the Faustian bargain. It is genuinely the one I happen to like the most. But obviously, I am compelled to bring up the deal with the devil motif, as I am making the case that it is the theme of the early 2000s. The story of Faust lives on through this great melodic metal record. Manowar, Gods of War. Manowar tends to be viewed as a meme by many metalheads, many thinking of their music as a complete joke. Even several Manowar fans themselves like the band fully ironically, because they are seen as so unapologetically cheesy.
On one you can always depend. I am thy friend.
They embody a pre-modern aesthetic so foreign to us that it of course will naturally rouse amusement in us moderns in our postmodern world. I too found them hilarious at first, but now I just view this as an epic. It is a take on Norse mythology, and is a tale of wanting to die gloriously in battle to venture to Valhalla. And to dial up the melodrama, almost half of the album is monologuing about Odin and whatnot.
Loki, god of fire, is the sworn blood brother to
to Odin himself.
This is easily the weakest part of the record. While it might enhance the epicness, it is repetitive and definitely skippable on repeat listens. However, the tracks themselves are memorable bangers. From Loki
God of fire, burning higher, God of fire, into the sky,
to Sleipnir.
across the rainbow bridge, to Valhalla, Odin's waiting for me.
Very easy to sing along to. The epic sound of Gods of War is of course power metal, but it is also symphonic metal and even Viking metal. The final track is completely separate from the overall story and is an ode to metal music called Die for Metal. Even if Manowar is too flowery for you, this is an anthem that all metalheads should embrace. The Dillinger Escape Plan, Ironworks.
I'll give you everything you want.
In the 90s list, I neglected to mention mathcore, which is a very chaotic genre, inspired by metallic hardcore, but it went in the exact opposite direction that melodic metalcore did. Instead of becoming more listenable, it became less listenable. Basically, it's jazzy and experiments with time signatures, which creates a glitchy type of sound.
Stumbling over dead forgotten.
And more power to you if you like Calculating Infinity and other angry late 90s mathcore. I can vibe with that every now and then. But for me, I prefer the Greg era Dillinger Escape Plan more. And not just because Greg can belt out the most intense screams one moment and then mellow out with a suave and sexy singing voice the next. But also because Ironworks takes some influence from funk metal, which amazingly creates some surprisingly radio-friendly type songs for a genre that is typically unlistenable for the normies. If System of a Down is already too weird for you, then this will probably be too much for you to handle. But if you're looking for something rather out there on the fringes of metal that's still a bop to jam to, I highly recommend Ironworks. Psychostick, Sandwich.
There's only so much that I can take.
Of eating dry Cheerios?
Some of you may be surprised to hear this, but I do indeed have a sense of humor. Generally speaking, comedy bands are quite terrible. Not only do they make crappy music, but they often aren't even funny anyways. Psychostick is a miraculous case of a band that successfully manages to be both good and funny. I guess this would be the place to mention Tenacious D, as they are likely the most obvious candidate for a comedy metal band from the early 2000s. And they even do a Deal with the Devil thing to boot. If I was going for top songs of the decade, I would include a couple from Tenacious D. But for albums, Sandwich blows the Pick of Destiny out of the water. I would describe Psychostick's sound as a mix of alternative metal, nu metal, and funk metal. They actually sound quite a bit like Mudvayne, except they are intentionally funny rather than unintentionally funny. Most of the tracks on Sandwich are about food, and even funnier, the songs actually follow each other. For instance, one song is about working at a fast food place, which leads to the next track about getting home and finding out that your roommate ate your leftovers, which is followed by a tune about being hungry because there's nothing to eat. So in a way, it sort of tells a story.
Okay, there's gotta be something to eat here. Let's see. Bag of spaghetti, no tomato sauce, a box of baking soda. I cannot eat that.
This is a pretty long record, a meaty sandwich, I should say rather, boasting 24 tracks. Granted, a good chunk of those are just comedy skits or short gimmicky tunes.
Who likes vaginas? I do. Who likes vaginas? That would be me.
But some of the highlights of this album are #1 radio single, which is a parody of radio-friendly alternative metal bands that dominated the airwaves in the early 2000s.
And this is where my producer told me to say yeah.
In other words, this is every Breaking Benjamin song ever made.
You're so cold, keep your hand in mine. It's alright. And this is the part part of the song where I sing about how I feel so cold inside.
There's also a dig at Metallica on this track.
You will be with me for all eternity. Yeah!
Another song called Grocery Escape Plan, as you can guess, is a parody of the Dillinger Escape Plan.
Think of a day I went to the store to get a gallon of milk, but then I found out that they only had 1%, but not 2%.
There's also a hilarious song about spam emails called You Got Mail Enhancement, which I swear takes influence from All That Remains.
If you engage in spam, there's something you should know. That I will hunt you down.
And I'll destroy you!
And they even mention All That Remains earlier in the record, so I do not believe that this is a coincidence. Sandwich is genuinely comedic gold, and it has such a love for early 2000s metal music. The ending ballad is also excellently humorous.
What if your dad was made of rainbows? You would be like, OMG, that's lame. I want a dad made out of ninja robots.
Forgotten Tomb. Songs to Leave. Fitting the early 2000s, my list reflects how tonally inconsistent the decade was. This is some depressive black metal. As the name would suggest, this is more depression than bargaining, and the style was far more obscure in the early 2000s than it was in the 2010s. Although, some would say that Forgotten Tomb is more blackened doom metal, which is of course a mix of doom metal and black metal. But whatever you call it, it is thematically the same, being about suicide. It's pretty gut-wrenching, so listen to it at your own discretion. But Forgotten Tomb is one of my favorite black metal artists for just how far they push the genre, gloomy and melancholic as possible. Sonata Arctica, Days of Grays. As I continue to be tone deaf, here is something more upbeat. This brings the power metal cheese to the maximum by combining it with symphonic metal, prog metal, and folk metal. Flag in the Ground is one of my favorite power metal tunes. It's about fleeing serfdom and trying to make a new life in the free world, while longing to reunite with a long-lost love. Good stuff.
We are free from eternal serfdom. I'm gonna bring you home, my life.
Another good one is As If the World Wasn't Ending.
As if the world wasn't ending. As if the world wasn't ending.
Also, there is a duet with No Dream Can Heal a Broken Heart.
Oh, my love, please be strong. If your heart can hear a song.
This record is beautiful and wholesome, with a lingering dark undertone, which is reflected in the cover art. Snowy mountains and aurora borealis, but then there is a skull and flames hidden in the middle. It might be corny to some, but I dig this. Lacuna Coil, Karma Code. You may remember an hour ago when I mentioned the duet between Dave Mustaine and Christina Scabia. Well, here's her actual band. Now, keeping with the duet theme, she duets with another dude here. Karma Code blends alternative metal with gothic metal. Our Truth is such a jam. I also must mention the ballad Within Me. Lacuna Coil often gets compared to Evanescence. While there might be some similarities, this is far from a clone. They authentically possess their own sound, at least to my ears. Very bassy and sensual. Overall different vibe, despite a similar style. So vibe on. Children of Bodom, Hate Crew Death Roll. Children of Bodom are generally seen as the band for newbies to extreme metal. I've lost count of metalheads who refer to them with embarrassment as their entry into metal as teenagers. Why is this? Are these people allergic to fun? Just own it. Children of Bodom have a unique style, being melodic death metal, melodic black metal, and power metal. I will happily piss people off by saying that this is basically Dissection but with keyboards. Much like the Black Dahlia murder, they have a very distinct sound. Their style is highly debated among metal autists, such as myself. I am also beginning to feel like Mr. Incredible, with all the metal icons dropping like flies lately. So rest in peace Trevor, and rest in peace Alexi. No matter what the gatekeepers might say, you have made some fun-ass metal. I retroactively declare these two bands fun-ass metal. Angels Don't Kill is a classic.
You gotta tear me apart, Lisa!
And even features everyone's favorite, literally me character, Patrick Bateman.
I want no one to escape.
Nevermore. This godless endeavor. This is my all-time favorite album. I'm not going to claim it's objectively the best. It's not the heaviest, certainly not the most fun, but my personal pick. As I mentioned in the 90s video, Nevermore have a bleak existentialism that I often relate to, and this one perhaps even more so. The title speaks for itself. Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, and thus, man becomes machine-like, without meaning in his life. You know, that philosophy stuff. The ballad track, Sentient 6, is about a robot designed to destroy humanity, yet he actually envies humans and longs for a soul.
I hate that I can't see the one that made me.
This one has always been emotionally powerful for me. As always, I must mention Warrell Dane's visceral and unique voice.
Tell me when, tell me why, tell me what this fucking life is for.
Jeff Loomis's guitar work is always excellent, and it enhances this exponentially. So many great guitar solos. Godless Endeavor sounds distinct, a blend of prog metal, groove metal, and epic doom metal. Two other great tracks are Final Product and Psalm of Lydia. The lyrics are pretty deep, attacking the media.
The media loves stage, it's tragic suicide. They exploit it, then package it.
And the over-medication of people.
All you feel and all you do, the medication controls you.
Job for a Cowboy, Genesis. Despite their funny and misleading name, this isn't country music, but rather a blend of brutal death metal and deathcore. Embedded is not only such a killer track, but also somewhat prophetic. It's definitely the standout of the album. I don't have a ton to say about this record though. It's quite heavy and quite fun. It's short, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. If I was Doom Guy, I would want this blaring in my helmet while I kill demons. It's just awesome. Simple as. Escape the fate. This war is ours.
We're gonna burn your city, gonna bring your system down.
I will absolutely admit that this is a guilty pleasure. This is probably the most teeny bopper metal record ever. I would wager that half of this record's fan base are 16-year-old girls, and the other half are nostalgic millennials that listened to this when they were younger. But you know, maybe there's too little fun in this world to feel guilty about enjoying something. This is oddly enough a blend of melodic metalcore and glam metal, a peculiar mix. Then again, there was a lot of 80s nostalgia in the early 2000s. It's got some poppy tunes, like On to the Next One, or 10 Miles Wide. But it also has some more metal ones, like The Flood. And the title track. I like to include variety, and holy crap, the early 2000s is a plentiful harvest compared to the others. This decade sure was a weird one. Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force, Perpetual Flame. Speaking of retro-inspired 80s-influenced metal, here is some power metal, speed metal, and neoclassical metal. I'm generally not a big fan of neoclassical metal because it's almost always instrumental, and I personally prefer bands with vocals. You can pretty much put all instrumental bands in the not applicable category for these lists. Not that they are bad, very well could be top-tier material, but they are disqualified if only due to my lack of interest. I don't play any instruments, so they aren't quite as intriguing to me. Not to mention, many in this genre are just showing off their guitar skills, because it is all about the virtuosity of the guitarist, and the record usually ends up sounding like one giant guitar solo. Thankfully, there are actual songs on this, with vocals and everything, such as Red Devil, and Damnation Game. Nobody wins in this damnation game, which are great jams, and the instrumental Caprici di Diablo is actually quite epic. Slipknot, Iowa. I caught some flack a while back for saying that All Hope Is Gone was Slipknot's best, but I like that album and this one for different reasons. All Hope Is Gone is much more radio-friendly, leaning into alt-metal, and alienating some fans. But it has some really catchy songs that I love despite this. Iowa, on the other hand, is much more violent and in your face. And even when it has softer moments, these moments are creepy and droning, and not exactly radio material. Iowa blends nu metal, groove metal, and rap metal. Slipknot is quite possibly the most well-known metal band of the 21st century, but Iowa is a much more intense experience than their other efforts. Corey Taylor's vocal delivery is definitely a huge factor in this, belting out aggressive screams one moment, and then switching to a vulnerable, softer voice the next, and then rapping every now and then. The versatility in his vocal style is something I've always appreciated, as someone who does metal vocals as a hobby myself. Not to discredit the other 16 members of the band, I just tend to talk about vocals the most, since it is my expertise. Iowa has a good balance of bouncy riffs, melodic choruses, and disturbing atmosphere. It's Slipknot. It's brutal in its own way, rich with angst and misanthropy. Stone Sour, Come Whatever May.
So take a sentence full of things you're not supposed to say, but don't run it down, but you'll be gone.
Now on the other side of the spectrum, if you enjoy the softer side of Slipknot, this album will suit you more. Stone Sour is Corey Taylor's other band. Come Whatever May is a mix of alt metal and hard rock, making it the most accessible to non-metal fans of all on this list. It is still an enjoyable listen though. It's got that sing-along quality of System of a Down.
I don't know what's wrong. It's like I'm too far gone. It doesn't matter anyway.
Some groovy metal and roll riffs.
What the fuck is free about it?
And some soothing ballads.
An epidemic of the mannequins, contaminating everything we thought came from the heart.
More of a rock album? Perhaps, but it's my list, so I can make the exception. My favorite track is Silly World, such an anthem, with great lyrics to boot.
I can't take your silly world. I can't take your silly world no more.
Scar Symmetry, Holographic Universe. This is such an underrated banger. I've mentioned before that prog metal is my favorite style, but I tend to gravitate towards bands that mix various styles. In this case, it's prog metal meets power metal and melodic death metal. This record has the best that metal music can offer. This is a truly transcendent experience.
You just get elevated, you get motivated, I'm in another fucking dimension, dude.
The lyrics are a bit esoteric, but portray awakening from the Matrix, if I may put it in the most trite and cliché way. As the initial lyric states, this is year zero. Eschew all notions of what you thought was the truth, and ascend to a higher plane. The vocals are amazing too, soaring highs and deep growls. The instrumentation never gets old, as there is always something interesting going on. There's some synthesizers too, and Holographic Universe also gets close to being djent in some places. Phenomenal piece of music. Alice in Chains, Black Gives Way to Blue. As many know, Lane Staley passed away in the early 2000s, and while he is irreplaceable, I think the band did a surprisingly good job carrying on their legacy with a new vocalist. They also modernized their sound for this new decade by ditching the glam metal and grunge sounds of their 90s material. Instead, here they are a mix of sludge metal, alternative metal, and hard rock, a perfect blend to both sound fresh for the aughts, yet also retaining a recognizably Alice in Chains sound. This might be the most successful example of a band changing both vocalists as well as sound, at least for a band as well known as Alice in Chains. A great comeback record. The Agonist, Lullabies for the Dormant Mind. This one has a rather interesting sound, blending deathcore, melodic metalcore, gothic metal, and progressive metal. It also has one of the most creative uses of contrasting vocals that I've ever seen. On the track Thank You Pain, her clean vocals are of someone on trial, making a plea for her innocence. Whereas her harsh vocals are the judge condemning her. Making the different vocal styles different characters in a story is a pretty cool artistic decision. My favorite tracks are Wait Out the Winter and End Their Eulogies Sang Me to Sleep. A unique record, definitely worth a listen. Motorhead, Inferno. Now, if all of this is too complicated and you miss the simple days of boomer metal, look no further. This is speed metal, nothing more, nothing less. Motorhead is most well known for their 70s and 80s works, but this might be my personal pick for their best. Sound-wise, it really isn't that different from their earlier stuff, but it does have better production. My favorite tracks are Life's a Bitch.
Just remember life's a bitch.
And In the Black.
I'm in the black, I'm in the black, I'm in the black again.
Inferno also ends with a blues track, showing the original influence of metal that is pretty obscured by the early 2000s.
You know the music brought us our babe, and we ain't never been back.
Limp Bizkit, Results May Vary.
Damn! Stick 'em, stick 'em, stick 'em, ha ha ha, stick 'em.
Yes, I know, I just lost all respect. But listen, I used to hate Limp Bizkit myself. Even back when I was a nu metal kid who got into metal through Korn and Slipknot, I thought Limp Bizkit was a bridge too far. I never liked rap metal, even then. But honestly, listening to them beyond just nookie and viewing them on my own, rather than just based on the popular consensus, they are actually better than I remember them being. And it's funny, because the consensus seems to be changing anyway. Limp Bizkit has had a resurgence in popularity recently.
Who that is, what it say, what it looks like, baby.
Now maybe, just maybe, it's only because music has gotten so bad that we actually are starting to miss the trashiest bands of past decades. Or maybe it's just nostalgia. Or maybe it's because Zoomers haven't been guilted into hating Limp Bizkit by Gen X, like millennials were. But Results May Vary is actually pretty good, not gonna lie. It's not even fully a rap metal album anyway. It has some alt metal and post metal influence too. Does it have cringy moments? Absolutely. But that's par for the course for this era, and music wasn't afraid to have fun back then. If you are still unconvinced of the metal quality of this, I suggest listening to the track Head for the Barricade.
Head for the barricade!
Chimaira, Resurrection.
I'm gonna pound you into oblivion. I will make you fucking bleed.
If you just want metal music full of breakdowns to just go ham to, some really heavy shit, this is it. Mixing groove metal, metallic hardcore, and melodic metalcore, this goes hard. There are little bits of guitar melodies and clean vocals here and there. But for the most part, this is just one giant mosh fest. I guess I've learned during the creation of this video that Andy Sneap might be my favorite producer. He's produced so many albums on this list. Nevermore, Arch Enemy, Megadeth, Job for a Cowboy, and now this. Resurrection is a whole bunch of chugging and screaming, done to perfection. Opeth, Ghost of Perdition.
The hope into the room is that you have to live before you die young.
Opeth is not for the impatient. Their tunes tend to be quite lengthy, but I think their varied sound of prog metal, melodic death metal, and doom metal keeps them from getting repetitive. As you have most likely guessed by now, I love bands that mix singing and screaming vocals. I like the contrast, so the early 2000s might just be my favorite decade for this reason alone. Michael's voice can be both calming and relaxing, but he can also channel his inner demonic grizzly bear when he feels like changing the mood. I think Opeth really sets the standard for progressive metal at this time. This is the perfect music if you wish to read a book in the most menacing way possible. Evile, Enter the Grave. Produced by the producer of Metallica's Ride the Lightning, Master Puppets, and Injustice for All, this is an ode to thrash metal classics like Slayer and Sepultura. No fancy genre titles here, this is just straight up thrash. Much like with my Motorhead pick, this is throwing a bone, both to the boomers, as well as all the kids that think they were born in the wrong generation. I think Evile is a great tribute to this style. It's a difficult thing to create thrash metal in the 21st century. You run the risk of it being stale and sounding dated, but if you try to incorporate new elements into thrash, you alienate and offend the old school thrashers, much like with what the melodic metalcore bands did. This band is definitely closer to the first two of these problems. If you've listened to Arise, or any Slayer album, you've basically already heard everything that Evile has to offer here. But if you love that stuff, and just want more of the same, this will scratch that itch for you. But the reality is there was a zeitgeist in the 80s and early 90s for thrash metal, and that Ride the Lightning in a bottle can't be artificially reactivated. That said, there are still some really good moments on this, so I'd still recommend this to any diehard thrashers out there. Killer riffs and solos all around. Between the Buried and Me, Alaska. This is a varied listen, blending deathcore and prog metal. It's got both intense riffage and breakdowns, as well as synth weirdness and atmospheric ambience. Some pondering music for the Faustian spirit right here. Unexpect, in a Flesh Aquarium. Yeah, as you can probably guess, this is a strange one. If you thought that System of a Down and Dillinger Escape Plan were odd, this is on another level, a circus of randomness. There's nothing else to call this other than avant-garde metal. It is just too crazy to be labeled anything else. It might be secretly brilliant, but good luck trying to find a coherent meaning in this. My favorite tracks are Desert Urbania and Take Me to the Carousel.
You darken our world to brighten the sky.
The early 2000s was an interesting time for metal music, and it was rich in experimentation. 80s metal tended to be more lighthearted and fantastical, while 90s metal was gritty and realistic. 2000s metal, however, tried to find some equilibrium between the two, making truly idiosyncratic music. While some of this stuff might sound downright silly to us now, it might still be my favorite era. The creativity was boundless, especially compared to the following decade, the 2010s. The Depression era. On the next list, I will tackle this decade. There are a surprising amount of gems in the 2010s, don't get me wrong, so stay tuned for that. But please, talk me out of making the next list 50 bands. My own Faustian ambition is exhausting me. This one took long enough to make as it is. Thank you for watching. Here are some honorable mentions.
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. You think you got the best of me, but what you have is out of me.